Have you ever wondered how a free country can just fall apart? How it can slide from a democracy into a dictatorship? Well, it turns out there's a pattern, a kind of blueprint for tyranny. And to really understand it, we need to look at how it's played out before.
So, here's the central question. How does a nation fall to a dictator? Does it happen in a flash, like some big dramatic coup? Or is it more of a slow burn, something that creeps in almost unnoticed? To figure this out, we're going to look at two very different countries that ended up in the exact same place, under total authoritarian control.
On one side, you've got Weimar Germany. This was a modern, industrial powerhouse right in the heart of Europe. And on the other, you have Republican China, a huge, mostly rural nation just trying to hold itself together after centuries of imperial rule. They couldn't be more different, right? But believe it or not, their stories show us there's a common recipe for disaster.
See, dictators don't just pop up out of nowhere. They take advantage of weaknesses that are already there, deep cracks in the very foundation of a nation. So let's break down the 4 key ingredients that make a country ripe for a takeover.
Okay, so first up, it almost always starts with the trauma of war. This deep collective feeling of national humiliation, it just eats away at people's faith in their leaders. And it creates this desperate hunger for someone, anyone, who promises to bring back their pride.
So in Germany, you had the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Its terms were absolutely brutal. And that, combined with this poisonous lie, the stab-in-the-back myth, created this massive festering resentment. Then you look at China, which was torn apart for decades by civil war, brutal warlords, and then a horrific invasion by Japan. All this chaos made the government look completely powerless.
All right, ingredient number 2, you throw in total economic collapse. When people can't feed their families, when their entire life savings just evaporate, well, you can't blame them for being desperate. They become open to radical ideas and extreme voices they never would have listened to before.
Just try to wrap your head around this number. By 1932, more than 6 million people in Germany were unemployed. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a crisis of hope. It was the perfect breeding ground for extremist parties like the Nazis to grow.
And you see the exact same dynamic in China. In Germany, crazy hyperinflation in 1923 basically erased the middle class. In China, you had millions upon millions of peasants living in abject poverty, being exploited by landlords. In both places, the governments in charge were totally unable to fix the problem, and they lost all credibility with the people.
So what's the third ingredient? A society that's already split into warring factions. An aspiring dictator loves this. They can pour gasoline on those fires, turning citizens against one another and pushing this powerful us versus them story. And it's amazing how each movement picked a very specific enemy. The Nazis, well, they pointed the finger at Jewish people and communists, blaming them for every single one of Germany's problems. The Chinese Communist Party did something similar, but they framed it as a class war. It was the massive peasant class against the evil landlords and the corrupt elite. It wasn't just about land. It was a promise of justice for people who'd been ignored forever.
And that brings us to the final crack in the foundation, a political system that nobody believes in anymore. When the government is seen as weak or corrupt or just totally ineffective, it creates this huge power vacuum. And you can bet there's a strong man waiting in the wings, ready to fill it.
Germany's Weimar Republic was a mess of shaky governments that were always falling apart, and they kept using this thing called Article 48, basically an emergency button that let the president rule without parliament. It made authoritarian power feel normal. In China, the ruling nationalist government was seen as hopelessly corrupt and completely disconnected from the suffering of its own people. Both systems had totally lost their legitimacy.
So, once all those cracks are there, the stage is set. Now we get to the playbook. These are the specific, deliberate moves that leaders make to turn a national crisis into their own absolute power. And right at the heart of this playbook, you always find the charismatic leader. Both Hitler and Mao sold themselves as the one and only savior of their nation. They made it all about them. Loyalty wasn't to Germany or China. It was to them, the Führer, the chairman.
This table really breaks it all down. Look, each ideology gives people a simple explanation for what's wrong, a clear enemy to hate, and a powerful, really tempting promise. For the Nazis, it was all about restoring national pride through so-called racial purity. For the Maoists, it was about economic justice through a class revolution. It was a vision that made the peasants the heroes of a new China.
Now, grabbing power isn't just about using brute force. The really successful authoritarians are masters of a two-pronged attack. They blend persuasion to get people on their side with raw coercion to crush anyone who gets in their way.
It's the classic carrot and the stick, right? For the carrot, you had the massive hypnotic Nazi rallies and the CCP's incredibly popular promise of land for peasants. But that carrot was always backed up by a very big stick. The terror of the SS hunting down opponents, and the CCP's horrifying public struggle sessions, where people were forced to publicly humiliate and even execute their own neighbors. This combination of hope and fear is incredibly powerful.
And you won't believe how fast it can all unravel. This timeline shows the Nazis taking apart German democracy in just 2 months. And the scary part? They used the system's own laws to do it. The Reichstag fire gave them an excuse, an emergency decree erased civil rights, and then, boom, the Enabling Act made Hitler a legal dictator.
You know, the historian Ian Kershaw absolutely nailed it with this quote. This wasn't just some hostile takeover. Hitler's power was built on a real base of popular support, but it was combined with a fatal mistake by the old conservative elites. They thought they could control him, use him to stop the communists, but they were so wrong. So what's the big takeaway here? What can we learn from all this? Well, these stories aren't just history. They're a warning. They give us a clear, timeless blueprint for how freedom can be lost.
And here it is, broken down into 5 simple steps. You start with a nation in crisis. You find the divisions in society, and you make them worse. You take advantage of a broken political system. You introduce a charismatic leader with a simple, powerful story. And then you master that mix of promises and threats. That's the pattern. That's the blueprint.
And that leaves us with one last, really urgent question. Just look around the world today. Do you see countries struggling with economic chaos, deep, bitter political divisions, a growing loss of faith in democracy? The whole point is to ask ourselves, are the same cracks that brought down Germany and China showing up anywhere else? History has shown us the blueprint. It's on us to recognize it before it's too late.